In this video, we're going to take a look at what a monopsony is. So monopsony is probably a word you've never heard of before, but for comparison, for our context, we're going to compare it to a monopoly. And just like in previous units, you've learned that a monopoly is a price setter. This is a price setter in the product market. A monopsony, on the other hand, is going to be a price setter when it comes to the factor market. So they are price setters. And a better word to use instead of price is wage. So they're a wage setter in the factor market. So one of the most important concepts to get from this is why a monopoly, why their demand curve is not equal to the marginal revenue curve. And for a monopsony, we'll understand why the supply curve is not equal to the marginal factor cost. Okay, but this idea of being a price setter or a wage setter is probably the most important thing. So we want to be able to compare these two things, monopoly and monopsony. And then once we know how to do that, we can compare a perfectly competitive with a monopsony, or a perfectly competitive product market with a monopoly product market. So one of the big concepts right here is for a monopoly, if they want to set a very high price, so let's just pick a number, but we'll say, let's say 20 is very high, that this is the price and this is the quantity that's demanded. They can only, let's say, sell one. But if they want to, if they decide they want to sell more, they want to sell a second one, remember, they have to lower the price of each one of those. They have to lower the price of the first one that they could have sold at 20, and they have to lower it to, let's call it 19. So they're minus 1 on the one that they could have sold for 20, but they're plus the 19 on that second one. So their marginal, their marginal revenue for that second one is the extra 19 minus the 1. So it's going to be 18. And if we go to the third one, they want to sell one more, they have to lower the price of these two, each by 1. So 18 and 18, and then they get the extra 18 for the third one. So they're plus 18, but they're minus 2. So it's going to be 16. And we can also calculate that by finding total revenue. And figuring out what total revenue is each one of these and finding the difference between those. So the first one, the total revenue would be 20. This is 20. And then it would be 38, which would be 2 times 19. And then the next one would be 36, and 18 is 84. All right, so this one would be, that's not right. Sorry. 54, and so going from 38 to 54 is an additional 16. So that's just showing us what our marginal revenue is. And if we were to graph that, we would see that we have this downward sloping demand curve. Let's call this 1, 2, and 3, and this is the price at each one of those, 20 and 19 and 18. And then we would see that marginal revenue goes something like this. It starts at 20, and then for the second one, it's down at 18. And for the third one, it's down at, let's call 16 down there. So the marginal revenue is this downward sloping marginal revenue curve like that. Okay, so with all that, that's just simple review for us. But back over for a monopsony, they're a price setter as well, just like a monopoly. Now, that doesn't mean they can set whatever wage they want to, but they can charge kind of different wages for different quantities of labor. And this is what makes up the supply curve. So we're going to use the numbers up here to take a look at that. But what you can see is that at a wage of 4, they can't attract any workers. That would be like if over here, if the price was 21, then the quantity would be 0, and they would have no total revenue, things like that. But if they want to, let's say, pay a wage of 5, they're only going to attract 1 worker. All right, but if they want to attract a second worker, they need to raise the wage of each of those 2 workers. So they need to raise the wage of the first worker up to 6, and then they can pay that second worker 6, and now they've got 2 workers. So this is going to be what we're going to look at for monopsony. When it comes to comparing these two, what we can see is that a perfectly competitive has the wage set by the market, and it's $9. And so we've seen this by saying this is the market, this is the supply of labor and the demand for labor in the market, and in this context, that's $9 set by the market. And then this is the quantity of labor. And this firm right here, takes that wage. They're a wage taker. This is the $9 wage that they have to pay everybody. So this is the supply, which equals the marginal factor cost for their for that firm. Okay? And then what we did, and I just already gave you the numbers, but we said there's a marginal revenue product. And for this one, we said, okay, so for the first one, so for 1, it was at 20, and at 2, it was at 25, and 3 was at 20, 4 was at 15, 5 was at 10, and then the 6th one was at 5. So you had this MRP curve that looked something like that. Demand equals MRP. And so you set your quantity of labor not at 6, but at 5. So 5 is the correct amount of workers to hire. So in this context, the imperfectly competitive labor market, they're not a wage taker. They are the entire market. This firm is the whole market. And so when we set this one up, we see, again, like I kind of alluded to before when comparing it to the monopoly, if they say, oh, we're only going to pay $4, they don't attract any workers. But if they raise the wage to 5, they can attract their first worker. If they raise the wage for all workers to 6, they can attract 2 workers. So when we calculate marginal factor cost, it's the change in cost for them by hiring another worker. But what we can see by this is like this. If we go from, let's say we go from 1 to 2. All right, so they have this 1 worker that they're paying $5. If they decide they want to hire 2 workers, they need to raise the wage of this worker by +1, and they pay both workers $6. So their extra cost is the $6 that they pay this extra worker, plus the $1 that they have to pay that first worker. And so their marginal factor cost is 7. Or if you went from 5 for 1 worker to a total of 12 for the other worker, for the 2 workers, your marginal cost went up by 7. Okay, so that concept just follows its logic all the way through until you have the rest of this. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are the different wages, and then marginal factor cost, you would notice, is above that by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4, and by 5. So if we were to graph that, it's gonna completely, it should remind us of downward sloping demand, downward sloping marginal revenue for a monopoly. Because if we graph this one, we have this upward sloping supply curve. So the quantity of labor and the wage, that's the supply curve. And then quantity and marginal factor cost is the marginal factor cost, just like we had demand and marginal revenue. So if we start down, if we say this is wage and this is our quantity, we'll say this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then this ranges from 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. 11, it goes up to 15, but we'll stop at 11, I guess. So the first one, at 0, we're at 4, something like that. And then it goes at 1, we're at 5. And at 2, 6, 3, 7, 4, 8, 5, 9, and 6, 10. So we have an upward sloping supply curve that looks like that. But we also know, because we have this demand doesn't equal marginal revenue, or price doesn't equal marginal revenue, over here wage the wage doesn't equal the marginal factor cost. So what does it look like? Okay, well, it starts at kind of the same point there, and then it's above it. So just like the marginal revenue was below the demand curve, because if you sell one more good, you have to raise the price of all the other goods, or sorry, you have to lower the price of all the other goods. And here, if you hire one more worker, you have to raise the wage of all the other workers. And so 2, we're at 7. And 3, we're at 9. And 4, we're at 11. And we're already kind of above it there. So it's going to look something like that. And that is my marginal factor cost. So I have the marginal factor cost and the supply. And then if you notice, this is exactly the same as it was before. So we have this kind of downward sloping. I'm just going to put it on here and not match those numbers, but we have this downward sloping MRP. All right, so we have the perfectly competitive over here. We have the imperfectly competitive monopsony over here. The last thing that's left to do is determine how many workers you should hire and what the wages that you pay them. And so just like we've learned throughout microeconomics, you marginally compare things. And so in the perfectly competitive on this side, what you do is you compare the MRP to the MFC. And you see the MRP is above the MFC all the way to that point right there. All right, so this is the extra cost of the firm. This is the extra benefit to the firm. So you stop there and you hire the 5th worker. So you compare MRP to the MFC, and that's your profit maximizing point. You do the exact same thing in a monopoly. You always compare the extra cost to the extra benefit. And so here, it's going to occur a little bit earlier at a different point. So this is your point that you're looking for right there. So this is the MRP, and this is the MFC. So MRP, MFC, MRP, MFC, and you stop right there. And so that, you hire 2, let's say. You don't go to the 3rd because that's where the MFC is greater than the MRP. So the extra cost is greater than the extra benefit. Then over here, we say, well, this is the wage that you pay because it's set by the market. But over here, this is a monopsony. So they get to kind of lower the wage compared to what it would be in perfectly competitive. So this is the wage set by the supply curve that they pay those workers. So let's call it 6. So they pay a wage of 6 that is lower than it would be in a perfectly competitive. Where would perfectly competitive be? Well, this is like a supply curve, and this is the demand curve. And so this would be like the perfectly competitive market. If you look at it like this, let's say this is a supply curve, and this is a demand curve. That's equilibrium. And so they normally, workers would get $8, and we'd hire, let's say, 4 of them. But this is a monopsony. So they hire fewer workers, and they pay a lower wage. So ultimately, that is what a monopsony is. The MFC, the marginal factor cost, is not equal to the wage because in order to hire another worker, they have to raise the wage of all the previous workers. So that was determined by these 2 columns right here. This, what we looked at on the graph, is really just the opposite of a monopoly. In 10 seconds, we'll do a monopoly right here. So a monopoly has downward sloping demand, downward sloping marginal revenue, upward sloping marginal cost. MR equals MC, up to the demand curve, that's my price, and I dot over. That's price, right? Remember, a perfectly competitive would be here. That's price, perfect competition, quantity, perfect competition. And this is a monopsony. So monopsony is upward sloping supply curve, upward sloping marginal factor cost, downward sloping demand curve, which is MRP. MRP equals MFC right there. That's my quantity. That's the wage, quantity, and this is where it would be in perfect competition. Wage, perfect competition, quantity, perfect competition. That's a monopsony, hiring workers. This is a monopoly, selling products.